Welcome to the North Carolina Synod course on life and conflict between Israel and Palestine, a Christian perspective. Now, one aspect of this is I want to emphasize a Christian perspective versus the Christian perspective. And all perspectives are welcome here, but I am not here to, I'm here to share my perspective, but not to dictate or promote it. So there's a lot of aspects here. I would say one rule of thumb of engagement that we all should have is trust and respect and listen, certainly. But one aspect I'm not neutral on, and I don't think any of us in this room would be neutral on, is injustice. Aspects of where there's an infringement on civil liberties or harassment. So we want to be respectful for what might be contributing factors to that and analyze and discuss that and listen to other people. But when we get into marginalizations or vulnerable population that are being marginalized, I won't be neutral about that. It's not that I won't. I'll be respectful for people that differ with me on that particular topic, but I want to have that out there. Because there will be times it might seem like I'm pro a particular issue. I'm going to attempt to basically always step back and explain what I understand in terms of the different filters that are contributing to the conflict. Okay? I am Michael Connor, and just by way of introduction, I became engaged in the Israel-Palestine conflict beginning in 2012. I was part of a short-term mission trip that went to Bethlehem on behalf of Christmas Lutheran Church and their senior ministry, Ajial. And we conducted a staff retreat. It was a leadership team building retreat. And before that, I knew very little about Israel and Palestine. I thought that Bethlehem was probably part of Israel, and I learned a lot and was very much inspired by the Christians community that I met at that time. Since then, I've been to Israel-Palestine twice. The most recent time was for 3 months in 2017 as part of the World Council of Churches program. The program itself is called Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel. And my purpose there for 3 months, I spent time with a vulnerable population of Palestinians in the South Hebron Hills region of the West Bank. And we'll hear a lot more about that in sessions 3 and 4, because there'll be a lot of personal examples coming from that experience. So in terms of the sessions that we have here, tonight, session 1, we'll be dealing with historical patterns and perspectives. Some core themes with regard to that are competing narratives. I think we can all identify with this in the United States at the present time, or maybe in our entire lives, that for most issues there are competing narratives, differences, and people are rational. They have perspectives and filters, and it results in competing narratives. We'll also see part of the conflict is there's emphasis of different events between or among those different perspectives. Session 2, Pastor Rhodes will be leading us on religion and the land. And a core aspect of this session will be theological patterns that lead to exclusivity and other theological patterns that lead to inclusivity. There'll be a lot there to unpack, but that can possibly be one aspect of how you would describe religion and the land. Session 3 and 4 will be dealing with life in Palestine. Now, again, a couple of core themes that I've come away with is Israel's paramount goals, and what from an identity of Israel, it all comes in terms of their policies. Everything else comes from a safety and security. Safety and security of the Israeli population is paramount, and a lot of what comes out from that in terms of policy, actions, etc., is all tied to safety and security. From a Palestinian standpoint, their core goals, from their perspective, is freedom and dignity. Now, sometimes there's good choices and bad choices with each component with regard to safety and security or freedom and dignity. But realizing those core aspects of who they are is helpful in understanding, again, what has occurred and what is occurring. Unfortunately, we'll see time after time in history, as well as in current activity, and we all have seen this, is violence derails these things from the standpoint of there's initiatives or poor decisions with violence that they think are tied to freedom and dignity or think they're tied to safety and security. But eventually, these basically derails aspects of any kind of reconciliation. And then session 5 and 6, we'll be talking about positive aspects of hope, the Christian presence in Israel and Palestine, and how they react to this and provide hope. And then also a lot of marvelous, inspiring aspects of activism among both Israelis as well as Palestinians. Okay? Now, in addition to the video, there is a session guide online, and I just want to walk through the content of the session guide. It has my contact information. It has the course outline that is a general description of all 6 sessions, and then a specific page or two about detailing the session. In that session guide, what you'll find is an outline of each presentation. We formed our outlines in the format of questions that we'll be addressing, and source materials that correspond to the outline. So from the standpoint of the online learning, when we get to a video, particularly a YouTube, we're able to present it here in the class, but because of copyright rules with YouTube, we're not allowed to embed that video within the video on the website for the Synod. So the link for the online video will be in the source materials. And then for those of you who perhaps want to dig deeper in a particular topic or aspect of what we're covering, there's other resources. This would include, specific to that session. This will include books, websites, and other documents. And I'm also open to any suggestions that you might have as you might come across additional materials to add to our reference guide. So we're finally to session 1 after all of that, okay? Thank you for your patience. So I talked about that we've organized it by question. The first question that we'll be dealing with is some level of terminology. Now, this might, for some of you, might seem very basic or rudimentary, but there's probably not very few conversations I've had about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict where people are asking questions about what these terms mean. So we want to get through that first. And then we're going to ask the basic question, has the conflict between Jews and Muslims been going on for centuries? We'll address that. We'll talk then about key political events and that created as well as contribute or maintain the conflict. I've also already given you a clue about violence, but we'll talk about that, about specific examples of violence and how it's impacted historically the conflict. And then very much this aspect, again, of all that we have up here, this might perhaps be the most exciting about competing narratives. This is one, I think, comes close to home for all of us in terms of competing narratives and in terms of our current environment and how to deal with competing narratives. So we're going to go through an example or two of competing narratives between Israel and Palestine, and actually reference an article that was written by a Palestinian about dealing with that. Okay. So, what do the terms Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, and Israeli mean? Any and all of these terms are related to characterizing a people or a community, deal with their culture, their dominant language or the linguistics, and in some instances, not all, citizenship, particularly Israeli. So I'm going to bring up an imperfect example to walk us through this, but I think hopefully it'll be more helpful than it is confounding. So let's picture the whole green space as the entire Arab world in the early 20th century. Because, by the way, one of the terms we have up here means something different today than what it meant historically, ending in the early 20th century. So let's just say this is the entire Arab world. This is Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Libya, Syria, etc., including Palestine. And so at this time, are all Palestinians Arabs? And the answer is yes, because all of Palestine, from the Mediterranean Sea on the west to Jordan on the east, Egypt on the south, and Libya and Syria on the north, all that area was Palestine. That's what was called Palestine. And were all Palestinian Muslims? No. Based on the 1922 census of the British Mandate, slightly less than 8 out of 10 were Muslims. We had 10% who were Christian and about 11% Jewish that would be considered at that time Palestinian Arabs. Arab is not a reference to a religious preference. So you had Palestinian Arabs who were Muslim, some of whom were Christian, and some of whom were Jewish. Okay? However, in 1948, with the institution of the country of Israel as a sovereign state, things changed. The real estate didn't change, but Israel came in. And this is where we get into self-identification or self-identity. What happened between 22 and 48 besides the ending in 48 with the state of Israel? There was a substantial emigration of Jews, primarily from Europe, that came into this land. Culturally, linguistically, they were not Arab. And with the state of Israel starting in 1948, they were citizens of Israel. So they were Israeli. Well, in addition to that influx of Jews that came mainly from Europe, you had certain Palestinian Arabs who were Muslim and others that were Christian that remained in the state of Israel. A number of them were refugees that left that area, but many of them stayed. To the point that today in Israel, 80% of the population is Jewish. And so these Jews, and some of these Jews, here's the place where it's imperfect. Some of these Jews, very few, were their ancestors were in this land beforehand. And so they could technically identify themselves as Palestinian Arab Jews who are Israeli citizens. That's very rare. Most individuals now, even with Palestinian Arab ancestry, speak Hebrew versus Arabic in Israel, regard themselves, and they are Israeli citizens, and would self-identify as a Jewish Israeli citizen. However, you do have in Israel today, you have Palestinian Arabs who identify themselves as, they are either Muslim or Christian, typically, but they are Israeli citizens. So what's happened with the rest, what's left in Palestine after the state of Israel? Well, in Palestine today, what's left in this green or this red outline box is basically the West Bank and Gaza. Overwhelming majority is Muslim, and about 2% are Christian. Over there, both groups identify themselves as Palestinian Arabs. So you have the religion play in addition to the term Arab. Over in the United States, I think we get pretty sloppy, frankly, with the terms. And a lot of us, unfortunately, don't think through the term, or our association subliminally is that some of these terms are equal when they're not exactly. Okay. So the next question, has the conflict between Jews and Muslim been going on for centuries? So this infographics, it looks like a game board, and I am not going to go through every piece, every place on the game board. But what we have here is a depiction of who was basically in political power, and we have these icons of Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and polytheism. And it goes way back to 1000 BC. So we see Israel's political power was during what was called ancient Israel up to 586, and then also over here the Hasmonean dynasty up till 63 BC. This was part of a semi-autonomous aspect of the Seleucid dynasty. But after that, there aren't any more Jewish or Star of David icons on the game board. And as a matter of fact, exile or exodus of Jews from this area occurred at different times during this time frame, pretty much culminating or ending by the end of the Roman Empire, maybe the beginning of the Byzantine era, whereby at this point, the Jewish population was quite small in Palestine from an ancient standpoint, historically standpoint. Notice when the political power is affiliated with Islam, begins in 638 AD, or Common Era. There are Jews here, but the conflicts occur. I mean, Muslims are part of conflicts, but it's not with Jews. It's with Christians. And you see that, particularly, they're toppled with the Crusades, then they come back in, and actually, in the more modern times, toward the end of the Ottoman Empire, and then the British Mandate, etc. The other aspect to point out is where we have the more recent political authority of Islam, particularly the Ottoman Empire. This was a very tolerant political power. They taxed people. They were certainly over the people, but they were very tolerant and allowed in Palestine a pretty culturally diverse community. As a matter of fact, in the early 20th century, this gentleman here, Wasif, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, Wasif is called the Storyteller of Jerusalem. There's a book available about him, and he lived from 1904 to 1948. He was an artist, composer, musician, and poet. Was raised in a Christian family. His formal education included both the Bible and Quran, and his family celebrated both Muslim and Christian holy days. This would be very foreign to us today, but from a cultural diverse community, they saw nothing. The community regarded these as significant and important to family and friends and their community. So again, this does not occur today, here or in Palestine. But it's refreshing to know that the conflict is not centuries old. The conflict is about a century long. Okay. So the next question, political events created the conflict and contributing factors to conflict. We're going to transition to a 10-minute video that's quite content dense. It's an engaging video, but it covers a lot of ground. It covers that whole century that we're talking about here. And so these are some of the key topics you'll see. Now, what we'll be doing is after the video is we'll start spending some time unpacking the video. So I'm going to transition now to that, and then we'll get back into the discussion. So a lot there, and repeated over, basically the occupation aspects of West Bank have been 50 years, and since 48 this year, this year is 70th anniversary for the State of Israel. So a lot of recurring themes. First of all, let's go back to Zionism. He mentioned Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl wasn't the first person to come up with the idea of a Jewish state or a nationalism versus, in addition to the religious identity of the Jews. But he was at the right place at the right time, and probably is regarded similar, maybe even more so, than we regard George Washington as the father of our country in terms of who he is. Now, the interesting thing is he was a journalist, and his ideology wasn't very rooted in religious thought at all. He was sort of a secular humanist. He engaged religious aspects or components of Judaism when they were aligned with Zionism, but he was a secularist. So the beginning, Zionism was more of a nationalism identity, and he did not start here. He was actually on the opposite side and thought that the best thing for the Jewish people were to assimilate across the world, and he was very intrigued by Europe and Enlightenment and regarded France, particularly Paris, as places where Jews could really could contribute and be part of society. That all changed prior to World War I, where he saw extreme racism, even in France. And there was one particular incident called the Dreyfus Affair, where a French officer was pretty much trumped up charges, was court-martialed. And it was Herzl and others came to the conclusion the only reason why he was being vilified was because he was Jewish, Dreyfus. So that was sort of the tipping point for Theodor Herzl to say the only real solution here is for the Jewish people to have their own Jewish state in Palestine. He actually wasn't firm on Palestine. There was one point where he was open to the idea of having it be Uganda, because that was pitched to him by England. But nonetheless, he died prior to 1948, but he had made it clear that he would wish his remains would be moved to Israel if, in fact, it ever became a state. And so there is a Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, where it's the most sacred or revered cemetery in all of Israel. It would be akin to our Arlington. And so you have government leaders, military soldiers that are killed, etc., all buried in Mount Herzl, which, by the way, is right next to their marvelous or amazing Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. The other aspect about his ideology, it was interesting at the time, and again, I think this is sort of just not only culturally speaking for Jews, but at the time in the early 1900s, there's a lot of movement toward perfection, or aspiring morally and secularly. And so these are words from his book, Our Hope, where he ends with, the aspiration is to reach moral and spiritual perfection through Zionism. And this, again, this was not just unique, I don't think, to Zionism or Judaism at the time. Again, it's not something you would see today normally. World War I. We heard about World War I. So what happened in World War I? You have in this depiction here who were the Allied forces in Europe and Asia, and who were the Central Powers. So, usually with World War I, we associate Germany and perhaps Austria-Hungary, but possibly we don't think about the Ottoman Empire being part of it, but it was. It was part of the Central Powers. So England, being part of the Allied powers, got together during the war, and this military officer McMahon arranged what's called the McMahon-Hussein Agreement in 1915 and 1917, and basically said, the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire, under Ottoman rule, that want to be independent, and we'll set you up as independent states in the Arab world. Come join us. And so they agreed to this, and in 1916 there was an Arab revolt. Hussein is pictured here in this picture, and can anybody, this military officer on the right picture of Hussein, does anybody have a guess as to who that person is?
Peter O'Toole.
I'm going to give you, that was my clue, would be Peter O'Toole from the epic movie Lawrence of Arabia. So this is T.E. Lawrence. And here's an excerpt from an intelligence memo during the Arab Revolt. And this doesn't come out in the movie much with Peter O'Toole. What does he write back to his superiors? These Arab states that might come out eventually, if we succeed against the Turks, will be harmless to ourselves. They're even less stable than the Turks. If properly handled, they would remain a state of political mosaic, principalities incapable of cohesion. It sort of sounds like a disingenuous Allied force, right? It's like, and also possibly, I might be reading too much into this, but perhaps England might contribute to misinformation or tension among the different Arab states to make sure that there's not much cohesion. Later in life, T. Lawrence apologized for these comments and backed off of them officially. But nonetheless, this was the, I guess, intent at the time. Let me go back, because I just covered the Arab Revolt. The other aspect of Britain, and this is probably, I think, maybe a reflection of polarization at the time, perhaps dysfunction with England or whatever, but at this sort of at the same time of the World War, you have Lord Balfour, a leading royal, not necessarily a government position, but Lord Balfour was a devout Christian who had an affinity for the Jewish people, and he came out with a declaration that was sent to an individual by the name of Rothschild, a Jew, who basically stated that the intent of England was to provide a Jewish home state with rights for non-Jewish Palestinians in Palestine. So basically, you have two sets of people, Jews and Arabs, expecting at the end of World War I to be over Palestine, okay? And neither one, I mean, the Balfour Declaration was not shared to Hussein or the other Arabs. So obviously different expectations. So at the same time, as we talked earlier about the large emigration, in 1922, Jews were about less than 20%, about 15% of the population. And we see in this less than 2-decade period, they become a third and a huge growth as well. So a lot of immigration is occurring prior to World War II. Then World War II and the horrific genocide of 6 million Jews happened. And the world all focused on the plight of what happened before, probably much during the Holocaust, but there was a lot of atrocities before the Holocaust. And so this was, again, a tipping point or major milestone to move toward the accountability of providing Jews a homeland in the Palestine region. So they alluded to this in the film and went through quickly. So I don't want, I don't want to over focus on it. But here's the original plan, UN Resolution 181, and it's a little bit of a gerrymandering congressional district or something from our standpoint. You have Israel in the Aqaba, starts up here and then goes around, and then you have actually three. This is somewhat contiguous. There's a little connection there, but you could basically say almost three non-contiguous components of what would be the Arab state. So this was not necessarily the most probable plan to be successful. The other interesting thing I want to point out, he mentioned it quickly in the video. See the white portion here? Does anybody remember from the video what Jerusalem was to be? Remember what he said? International. It was basically the Hong Kong of the early centuries. It was not meant to be under the auspices of either political power for the same reasons we have controversy today. It was regarded as a holy city for the three major descendants of Abraham, etc. And they said, okay, no. And this is Jerusalem is that point there. They were going to make it a fairly large, not relatively small from our standards, but fairly large area of land. This was not just going to be Jerusalem proper or the old city. This is a bit of real estate here. That never happened. None of this ever happened because the Arabs refused it. The Arabs refused it. Why? They were expecting to get all of this. And so they felt disenfranchised that the British really weren't being level-headed with them, weren't dealing above the table. So the British mandate ends at midnight, May 13th. And at midnight, beginning May 14th, Israel declares independence. And the very next day, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq. Transjordan is basically West Bank today. All go to war against Israel. About a year later, there's a ceasefire, and notice the change from this is before the war. Notice there's a change already from the UN partition plan in terms of what Israel's taking, and then after the war, Egypt is under Gaza control, West Bank is under Jordanian control. So that's the first milestone that Israel focuses on a great deal in terms of 1948 and the establishment of the country and who they are and what they're about. There certainly was, as we said, with refugees, a lot of displacement of Palestinians at the time. But think about it. 1948. If you're, age of, in terms of where you have memories, let's say starts at the age of 4 or 5, okay? Add 70 years to that. The people that still remain from a Palestinian standpoint, or even Israeli standpoint, that were directly impacted by the war, in another 2 decades, they will be gone, right? And so there is a segment on both sides that focus on 1948, particularly on the Palestinian side, but there's a much larger segment that focus on the milestone of 1967. Because these, with 50 years, this is 2.5 generations of people that are relatively younger than those that were experienced in 1948. So for many Palestinians and Israelis, the focus is 1967 and 1948 is sort of ancient history for some. So, 1967, it's 3 countries against Israel: Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Israel captures additional territory than before. Now they have the military rule over West Bank, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. As they talked about here, again, it's sort of eerie about the corresponding themes in terms of trying to come close to peace and then it being derailed by violence, particularly assassinations in the beginning. Here we have Carter with Sadat and Begin. And this begins diplomatic relations between Egypt and Israel. Israel's allowed to use the Suez Canal. Israel gives back the Sinai Peninsula. There were settlers, back to the movement of settlers in the West Bank, there had been settlers moving into the Sinai Peninsula. They all move out. And the result is Sadat's assassinated. And it's not only the crime or the unfortunate circumstance of assassination of an heroic figure who wanted to work toward reconciliation and peace. It's that after that assassination, in both instances with him and when we'll see with Begin, not Begin, it's Rabin. They're replaced by more conservative leadership. So the opportunity is ended, and it's not picked up, or it moves more further in the area of polarization. So this is what we basically have today, is Israel's control. Oops, sorry about that. Israel's control over the West Bank and Gaza. Also talked about Intifada. Literally, it means shaking off, but uprising, in other words, are synonymous with it. It ends. The Oslo Accords were effective in stopping the violence that was perpetrated by Palestinians, particularly the PLO, because basically the Oslo Accords provided the opportunity of the PLO to have a say more formally through the Palestinian National Authority. And Yasser Arafat was the leader of that. The second Intifada, not so much. It basically, because it was very much centered around Hamas perpetrating the force against Israel, what this actually shows, and unfortunately people talk about, well, I wish Hamas would just stop doing what they're doing. They have a memory about what happened in the Second Intifada, because basically, from their way of perspective or thinking, they got Israel's withdrawal of the Gaza Strip. There were settlers in Gaza, and it came to the terms where all the Israeli settlers left Gaza. Now, the course today is Gaza is basically under siege, and it's a terrible place in terms of how it's barricaded. But they, nonetheless, from their filter, they would say, well, we got Israel out of Gaza. It also was the beginning of the security wall between the West Bank and Israel. So, competing narratives. And this is very timely for us. I'll get to that in just a minute. But occupied versus disputed territory. So from a Palestinian standpoint, there's international law. Hopefully there's no surprise in that regard. But international law, with the Fourth Geneva Convention, there's an Article 49 that basically says the winner, the occupying power, shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. So Palestine, along with a number of countries around the world, would say that Israel is not in compliance with international law. The settlements are not in compliance with international law, to be specific, because they've not only occupied the West Bank, but you have settlements there. However, from Israelis' perspective, they're saying, well, wait a minute. This was Transjordan. It really wasn't a sovereign country in and of itself. And basically, it was a wilderness. And that there was some population, but there certainly wasn't a sovereign power there. And so the Jews have every claim as valid as anybody else, because we were there a couple thousand years ago. And therefore, Article 49 doesn't apply. And so when Israel comes across, I mean, it's sort of like you show your hand based on the term you use. If you hear disputed territory, chances are it's either from an Israeli perspective or a sort of maybe a pro-Israel kind of perspective. If you hear occupied territory, it's one coming from the vantage point of the Palestinians. So the example that happened literally maybe 2 weeks ago in this country was the NBA All-Star voting. Anybody see this or know what I'm talking about? So NBA All-Stars now, it's an international voting process, because many of the teams have people from all over the world now. So when you vote for the NBA All-Stars and you fill in your name and your address, there's a drop-down box by country. And for Palestine, they had in the drop box, Palestine occupied territory. Well, the Israeli sports minister saw that, took offense, contacted the NBA, and said, this is awful that you say Palestine occupied territory. You're going against the current political administration views in the United States, president, the executive branch, et cetera. You have to change that. And the NBA said, oh, we're so sorry. This was just a standard drop-down box. We had no idea. And so they changed it. I think they just changed it to Palestine. I don't think they said disputed territories, but they took off occupied territories. So it does matter to the two sides as how to refer to it, if you're saying disputed territories. So here's a question for you. No, there's no right or wrong here, but would like you to think about this question. What do you think? A, Israelis occupy Palestinian land. B, Palestine occupies Israeli land. Or C, other, not sure, there's other factors, and I don't want to take a side. Okay. Well, here are some international results with this question. There was a poll done in March of 2016. And the interesting thing about this was an international poll, and they had enough respondents from United States, England, Mexico, and Canada. So we'll start with our country, United States. The largest segment, almost 50% of the U.S., said Palestinians occupy Israeli land. Now, there's a significant portion that said that Israelis occupy Palestinian land, almost 40%, but the largest percentage. We are different than the other three countries. In the other three countries, in each instance, England, almost 60% said Israeli, Canada, a little over 51%, and Mexico, 54%. We're also second lowest in terms of other. 1 in 10 didn't choose either one. Mexico was smaller than we were, but the others were larger. So the others, all three of the other countries had a larger gap between the two choices, and all three of the other countries had a higher proportion of the view of Israelis occupying Palestinian land. Again, I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but it's interesting how we diverge as a country from other nations.
Do you think that there's any influence on our own sense of nationalism that influences that?
Well, I think so, sure. There's a couple things. Our own sense of nationalism, there's a lot of parallels about who we are and where we think. You know, I mean, and this has only been recent years, you know. Do you regard that you're from an imperialist nation? Do you regard that we are an imperialist culture? Now, that's a rhetorical question. I'm not asking anybody on the spot. But if you think about our history, there's a lot of who we are that we are an empire that's viewed as an empire by much of the rest of the world. You know, we'll use words like superpower and leader of democracy or champion of democracy. And I'm not trying to disparage the United States, but I'm just saying from our filter and who we are, from our fabric, nationalism, patriotism, whole aspects of what we hold and how we define that, and whether it's a dictate of our culture, and whether we can question some of that, or when you don't question some of that. I mean, some of us, you know, experienced the whole aspect of the Vietnam War and the recent movie The Post that's out there. What do you do when you find out something that's wrong, but from a nationalism standpoint is considered secret, or you're breaking the law? How do you deal with things like that? So I don't want to get off on a tangent, but it is complicated. That I do think our present policies, etc., and support. We're actually supporting both sides here. We'll talk about that in subsequent sessions. But sometimes we'll get into unconditional support on the Israeli side that I question at times about how healthy that might be. So along the line of this aspect of Palestine and being a people and existing, there's another video, 6-minute video. It's not as dense, it's a little more engaging. But what we have here from a background standpoint, before we go to the video, there's an individual, Danny Ayalon, a former ambassador from Israel to the U.S., Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and he was part of the foreign ministry of Israel. Now he's sort of on his own as a spokesperson. There's a video he put together about his position that would be in line with Israel's position about Palestine. And what we have here is a second iteration where a Palestinian group took that video to get into promoting their narrative. So what I'd like to, before we get into this last part, reactions to the video. This was sort of like I said, there's a second generation. Now, before we get into that, just by the way, there's a third generation. Danny comes back where he brings the women into his video and does a little bit of rebuttal and also then dives into another subject. So there's this point, counterpoint, point kind of a thing. But perhaps what I'd like you to do is think about what you just saw and give me 1 or 2 words reaction to the video. And any whatever word or 2 words come up.
Polemic. Polemic.
Polemic.
Self-righteous.
Self-righteous.
Do wars have consequences?
Wars have consequences.
Contradictory.
Contradictory. Good. Let me pose another question. In both viewpoints, who do you think they were talking to?
The echo chambers.
They were they really weren't expecting to change each other's position, right? I mean, other words that come up in my mind are well produced, somewhat entertaining or clever, but frankly, even after we get through that, we might learn a little bit, but we're actually, I think, confused, if any, anything. These are not meant to reconcile. These are meant to be. This is a quintessential example of competing narratives, right? So perhaps this might have occurred to all of us in terms of trying to avoid competing narratives. But what I found was refreshing was there's an article in Haaretz. This is a Israeli newspaper, available online. This is in the session guide. It's a moderate newspaper, but basically, Palestinian Dr. Husseini has an article in there about competing narratives, and just a few points that I'd like to mention, and then actually get into any other discussion as we close out the session. Number 1, peace talks require recognizing that the legitimacy of your own narrative is not dependent on negation of the others. That's probably hard to do, because I think, frankly, there's some DNA aspect of us as a human to do that, to negate the other's narrative. But that doesn't mean that makes ours more legitimate. Reflecting critically on the true cores of your own narrative. Do we do that? Do we really self-reflect and be critical about our own narratives, or do we spend much more mental energy coming up with the most rational or logical sequence to support our own narrative? How critical do we think about our own narratives? And then this goes both ways, either with our narrative or the other's narrative. Questioning individuals that dictate the narrative. And again, I think this, based on who we are here in the United States, these ring as true as what Husseini is trying to purport for reconciliation between Israel and Palestine. And lastly, re-examining the true importance of specific facts and connections. There could very well be all sorts of facts and that are absolutely true. I mean, one that we just heard about was who started the Six-Day War. Was it Israel or Palestine or the Palestinians that actually engaged? Now, there is a fact behind it, I mean, that occurred. But does that matter, really? Who started it? Actually, I mean, this sounds like a grade school altercation that you've gotten in and you're trying to stop it. And what's the first reaction of 2 second graders fighting? Pointing to who started it, trying to, I guess, divert it, or that's an important aspect. So we see that here as adults as well, is that certain specific facts and concessions might very well be true, but how important are they? And do we accept and blindly and otherwise think that they are absolute necessary parts of the whole, when in fact other things might be much more important, and we're spending all this mental energy and emotional strength on focusing on those things. I thank you for your patience. So this includes session 1. Next week, Pastor Rose will be taking us through religion in the land.